Interaction recently in the UK and also in the US where I live with designers and people working in tech, realizing that we have the power to make the world a better place through the projects that we work on. But as Ernesto just said to me before, often, what was it you said, Ernesto? The path to hell is paved with good intentions. And in spite of some of the best intentions of people working in technology, we're going through something of a tech backlash at the moment, with technology that was thought to really help the world has been now stealing people's attention or being used to spread hate speech or misinformation, or used to trick us into buying more shit that we don't need. But designers are starting to realize that we have a lot of influence. And there's movements like this one, Tech Won't Build It in the US, where people are refusing to work on projects that are going to harm society. And we've seen some good examples at companies like Amazon and Google, where designers and engineers have stood up and said, no, we're not going to work on anything that we think to be unethical. Now, this talk isn't going to be a call to arms for people not to work on design for bad, because I hope none of us are going to be doing that, but rather to think about the steps that we can take to avoid any unintended consequences, which tend to lead to most of the instances where design for bad does happen. So let's take an example. This was a charity that my wife used to work for, and they were involved with an NGO in the US. And they came up with this fantastic piece of design engineering. So the concept was a children's roundabout. And as children played on this, it would pump water, which would then be stored in a tank, so that people in remote villages could get access to clean, fresh drinking water any time of the day. And this project intended to provide fresh drinking water to 10 million people in Africa. And they seem to have thought of everything. And the US government under Obama pledged millions of dollars to fund this initiative. Jay-Z himself personally pledged $400,000. But when researchers went back a year later, they found that things hadn't gone quite as well as intended.
I assumed that the technology was rolling out well, and that lots of people across Africa were getting fresh, clean drinking water due to this technology called clay pump. But I found out about a year ago that things were not going well, so I went with a camera and went back to Africa to find out for myself on the ground what was going on.
So what are some of the kind of systemic challenges? Is it an organizational problem? Is it a rollout problem? Is it a problem with the actual tool itself?
I think part of it was this push to get many, many clay pumps into the ground on a fairly quick timeline. And I think that proved to be challenging from a maintenance point of view, that pumps would break down and they were not able to be fixed. And that had significant repercussions because, you know, as I say, we're not talking about television sets that are breaking down. We're talking about people's access to clean drinking water. So when a pump breaks down, that's really critical and can be detrimental to a community. And I think there were also kind of cultural issues that I think that not every community where a clay pump is installed necessarily needs technology. So there was some pushback from the users themselves. And I think finally the main thing is that this is supposed to be a toy that children play on. And as they pump and spin around and around on the clay pump, fresh water is pumped at the same time. And I think they found that children, like everywhere in the world, sometimes get tired of playing on one toy all the time. But if they were relying on the energy of children, they really needed them to be spinning and spinning literally for hours a day to provide adequate water. And of course they weren't. And that's another thing that I found on the ground there in my reporting.
So it's projects like this that are really setting out to make people's lives better and improve health and well-being and the environment, where the stakes are that much higher and the risks of unintended consequences are potentially more serious, rather than if we're working on a brochureware website or an entertainment app where the stakes are lower. But often it can be difficult when you're involved in a project to know whether this is going to make the world a better place or whether actually it has the potential to make things worse. So I'll list a few projects that I've been involved in over the last few years, and you can have a think about whether you think these are designed for good or designed for bad. So an educational website for preschool children, or a decision support system for live battlefield operations for the British military. An application to manage the construction of a battleship. A counter-terrorism surveillance application. A website for a credit card company that specifically targets people with poor credit history. And healthcare data design for the National Health Service. So in each of these projects, everybody on the project team thought that they were designing for good and doing a lot of good for the users and for the world. So with the educational website for preschool children, it's just this year that the World Health Organization has published some new guidelines that preschool children should never be allowed to passively watch screens. But we didn't know this at the time when we were working on this project. With the system for military intelligence for the British Army, the people on the project team all believed that they were making the world safer and they were going to be preventing loss of life by having better information for company commanders on the ground. This one with the application managing construction of a battleship. Well, battleships are designed for killing as many people as possible, but this particular project focused on the environmental impact of such a big construction project and how to reduce waste and reduce the use of materials. This counter-terrorism surveillance application for government, I had a long meeting with the ethics board of the company who were delivering this, and they assured me that this project had passed all their ethical tests, and in their words that it was going to be used to catch terrorists and pedophiles. But they hadn't really placed so much importance on the fact that this was going to be monitoring innocent civilians, and this is the price that is paid for an application like this. This website for a credit company for people with poor credit history. The UX lead on this project really felt that they were giving opportunities to people who'd been refused credit in the past. And then finally this one with healthcare data design for the NHS. This was a really interesting project because obviously it's a large organization with a lot of people working on this. And people had very different views about what was designed for good and what was designed for bad. And this trade-off between protecting individual patient privacy on the one hand versus maximizing the opportunities of using this data to spot trends and improve public health at a national level on the other. And a lot of unwillingness to compromise, with everybody thinking that they're the ones who are in the right and anybody who disagrees is in the wrong, led to some unintended consequences and slowing down the benefits that could be delivered from a project like this. So rather than thinking about what is good and sort of entrenching in this idea that I'm right and other people are wrong, it can be easier to take steps to reduce the risk of unintended consequences in the same way that we take steps to reduce the risk of user rejection of the products and services that we work on. So I'll go through some steps that we could take to maximize the chance that we're going to end up being the goodies in the long run. So first one, listen first and see the big picture. So in response to the play pump story, Michael Hobbs, who's an international development specialist, said, we're always arguing that if rich countries want to solve the problems of poor ones, they're going to have to spend time getting to know them. So of course, this is the first principle of human-centered design, that the design needs to be based on an explicit understanding of the users, their tasks, and their environment. But too often, this process of running a discovery phase can tend to be superficial, focusing only on the primary users and not considering secondary users or other people who might be affected. And the International Standard on User-Centered Design, deliberately for this reason, changed its title to be Human-Centered Design to reflect the fact that people affected by technology are more than just users. So as UX designers, we need to insist on the opportunity to really get to deeply understand the people that are going to be affected, not just to reduce the risk of the project failing, but to reduce the risk of unintended consequences as well. Next, broadening the use cases. So a lot of other industries that have the potential to impact people's health and well-being do a much better job to build in redundancy and consider what could possibly go wrong and what the impacts of this might be. So for example, the Hoover Dam has slipways that were included in the design process more than 100 years ago that have only been used twice in that time to deal with extreme weather events. And of course, this redundancy makes projects that much more expensive to implement, but in the long run, lead to much better outcomes. And as UX designers, we need to be thinking about not just the immediate impact of projects we work on, but also considering what could go wrong. What are some of the technical constraints? What are some of the potentials for misuse? And of course, this is difficult. Expecting the unexpected is difficult. But the best way to ensure that we do consider possibilities where things could go wrong is by having diverse and inclusive teams. Too often, technology projects are delivered by people who have never been discriminated against, never been subjected to hate speech, or been stalked, or been oppressed by corrupt governments or organizations. But by insisting that we have diverse teams, not only do we improve the quality of our design work, but we reduce the chances that things could have bad outcomes for society. Breaking down silos is something that UX designers often talk about. So as the voice of the user on large projects with multidisciplinary teams, UX specialists are perfectly placed to bring the different disciplines together. But we need to go further than this. Often design for bad happens when people's incentives are misaligned. So business analysts might have their own targets, CEOs have their own priorities, engineers have their own things that they're worried about. But by bringing these different disciplines together and aligning incentives, and also thinking beyond just the project that we're working on, we can make sure that design for bad doesn't happen by slipping through the cracks, and bring everybody together so that we're all working and all on the same page. Another benefit of human-centered design is getting buy-in from the users. But often, users that are excluded from human-centered design tend to also be those groups who are most potentially adversely affected by bad design. So people from indigenous groups or ethnic minorities, people on low incomes, people from the LGBTQ community. Anybody from these groups who often tend to not be so closely involved in the delivery of technology projects tend also to be those same people that are most adversely affected. As UX designers, we need to make sure we're getting buy-in from everybody who could be affected. And that starts with the recruitment process for any user research that's happening. Taking the responsibility seriously. Hanlon's razor says that we should never attribute to malice that which can be explained by stupidity. And often when people feel that they have the moral high ground, they can tend to relax and stop taking things as seriously as if it's more of an ethically ambiguous project. Other industries, such as medical profession or architecture or structural engineering, have much stricter licensing and professional development processes in place. But as UX designers, we need to be responsible for our own continuing professional development, and also making use of best practice and standards wherever possible. So accessibility guidelines, the International Standard on Human-Centered Design, but also things like the European General Data Protection Regulations and ethical research guidelines from the British Psychological Society. All these things can help us reduce the risk of unintended consequences by following best practice, even though this ultimately makes our jobs harder. And then lastly, raging against short-termism. This Silicon Valley mantra of running fast and breaking things has led to a lot of damaging projects being released over the last few years. We need to make sure that we are learning from our mistakes, but following best practice so that we reduce the possibilities of mistakes happening in the first place as far as possible, and taking the responsibility as as seriously as we can. We need to insist that any KPIs or performance metrics are long-term and not short-term, so that we can maximize the chances of designing for good. So overall, by expanding the perspectives and considering how systems are going to work in the long term, we can anticipate secondary consequences of our work. Of course, this takes more effort in the short term, but nobody ever said that saving the world was going to be easy. Thank you.
Perfectly timed. Thank you very much. Every week. Questions, please.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. I feel like I detected tension, particularly in innovation and entrepreneurialism, where time to market can be extremely important. When you're innovating, your time to reflect on things, and as you say, this rush to sort of go forward. Doesn't matter if you break it. Doesn't matter if your initial product is crap. You get it out there, you see whether it works or not, whether it physically functions. How do you resolve this sort of more reflective approach and more engaged approach with that need, that need for speed, which is dictated by the market?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's being driven by a few different angles. So companies are becoming more concerned with their long-term reputation and reputational damage of projects failing. But another important thing that's happening is employees within companies standing up and insisting on there being a longer-term approach to things. And this is starting with companies like Google and Amazon and Facebook, where they're seeing their key differentiator as being able to attract and retain the best possible people. And so if these people are getting unhappy with the direction that the company is taking, that's a big organizational risk, that the company might end up losing key talent within the organization. So designers have influence, even if incentives are being driven by short-term thinking. But then, I mean, generally, a lot of these principles are going to contribute to having stronger product offerings in the short term as well as the long term. And I think as a society, I hope that we're realizing that thinking slightly longer term is going to be the best way for business success. And it's not going to happen overnight, but I think we just need to keep trying to do the best job that we possibly can.
We have time
Thanks.
for one more question.
I feel like, especially in tech, design has almost been, especially in software tech, I would say, maybe less so hardware tech, but software tech design has sort of been this sort of function sitting on the sidelines, if you like, of the product team.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
A good team will always work closely between product and design, but I feel like there is this sort of disconnect between the potential of design to be a positive force and the day-to-day reality of the design function within product teams, which is often just there to do a specific set of functions to then have, test something and hand something over to the developers. Do you see any sort of change to that situation where in software tech design starts to play a sort of broader role around, answering questions, should we build this, or other types of ethically related questions?
Definitely. I think it's a similar answer again, that it's good design has been seen to be an important differentiator that makes one company or one product better than another. And with this advancing influence of good design, it is starting to have more of a say in the direction that companies are taking. So I think this is only going to have more influence as time goes by. And so in that sense, it's ever more important for designers to be thinking about ethics right from the very beginning. And with great power comes great responsibility.